Eliza Thorne was walking into the Whisperwood to die. The sun, a merciless copper coin in the vast, bleached sky, beat down on the cracked earth of her fallow fields. A year. It had been a year since the fire had stolen everything, the laughter of her husband, the soft weight of her infant son in her arms, the very scent of hope in her own home. Now, the farm was a husk, a monument to ash and memory, and she was a ghost rattling within its walls. The bank, which was to say, the town's iron-fisted patriarch, Cyrus Blackwood, would foreclose by week's end. There was nothing left to fight for. The forest, dark and final, seemed a kinder end than the slow, public starvation of the soul she was enduring. She clutched the faded photograph of her family, its edges soft with a year of desperate tears, and stepped from the glaring sun into the cool, silent gloom beneath the pines. Each step was a farewell. Farewell to the birdsong she would no longer hear, farewell to the pain that had become her only companion. She found a small clearing where the light dappled through the canopy, a place that felt both serene and sound, a fitting chapel for a final prayer. She was in the very act of sinking to her knees, of surrendering to the crushing weight of her sorrow, when a sound, thin and impossible, pierced the quiet. It was a cry. Not the cry of a hawk or a fox, but something achingly familiar, a sound that resonated in the empty chambers of her heart. It was the cry of a baby. For a moment, she thought her grief had finally fractured her mind, that she was hearing the ghost of her own lost child. But it came again, more insistent this time, a desperate, raw plea for life. Drawn by an instinct she thought long dead, Eliza pushed through a thicket of ferns and followed the sound. There, at the base of an ancient oak, lay a bundle of tattered wool blankets. And from within that bundle, a tiny, red-faced infant wailed at the indifferent sky. The baby was no more than a few weeks old, her skin chilled, her cries growing weaker. Someone had left her here. Left her to the elements, to the predators, to a silent, lonely end. Eliza's own despair, so vast and all-consuming moments before, was suddenly dwarfed by a rage so fierce it made her tremble. How could anyone do this? She knelt, her hands shaking, and gently unwrapped the coarse blankets. The baby girl looked up at her, her crying softening to a hiccup as her deep blue eyes, shockingly clear and intelligent, locked with Eliza's. In that instant, the world shifted. The forest was no longer a tomb, it was a nursery. The air was no longer heavy with finality, it was charged with purpose. She had come here to end a life, but instead, she had found one. Cradling the infant against her chest, Eliza felt a warmth spread through her she hadn't felt in a year. It was the warmth of purpose. The warmth of protection. The cold shell around her heart cracked, and for the first time since the fire, a single, defiant thought took root: I will not let you die. She turned her back on the deep woods and began the walk home, her steps no longer weak and aimless, but firm and measured. She had a child to save. Eliza named the child Lily, for the way she seemed to have bloomed impossibly out of the dark earth of the forest. In the days that followed, the silent, dusty farmhouse was transformed. The air filled not with sighs of grief, but with the gurgles and cries of a newborn. Eliza, who had barely eaten for months, now found the energy to scrub the floors, to air out the linens, to boil water and mash vegetables. She sold her late mother's last piece of silver jewelry to the general store owner for a pittance, using the money not for her own needs, but for milk and soft cloth for diapers. Caring for Lily was a grueling, constant task, but it was a holy one. Each time she held the tiny, trusting body against her own, she felt another piece of herself knitting back together. The ghost in the farmhouse was becoming a mother again. But the world outside her small circle of renewed hope had not forgotten her. One afternoon, a heavy knock rattled the farmhouse door. It was Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was known to be as flexible as Cyrus Blackwood's wallet. His eyes, small and shifty, darted past Eliza to the cradle rocking gently by the hearth. "Heard a rumor, Eliza," he said, his voice attempting a folksy friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you found something out in the woods." Eliza's body went rigid. Her hand instinctively rested on the cradle. "I found a child, Sheriff. An abandoned baby left to die." And Brody chewed on his lip. "Folks are saying, well, it's unusual. A baby just appearing. Mr. Blackwood, he's a man who likes things orderly. His concern, the mention of that name was like a chill wind. Cyrus Blackwood's concern was never a comfort, it was a threat. What business was it of his? If you were Eliza, what would you have told the sheriff? Would you have trusted him, or would you have stood your ground? Tell me in the comments below. Mr. Blackwood's concern is duly noted, Eliza said, her voice colder than she expected. But this child is my concern now. She was abandoned. I am caring for her. The sheriff took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Blackwood thinks the child should be turned over to the county. For her own good. To find her a proper home, a proper home. The words dripped with condescension. He meant a home chosen by Blackwood, a fate decided by him. A quiet fury, the same fury she'd felt in the forest, rose in Eliza's throat. She has a proper home, she said, her voice low and unwavering. Right here. Brody, unaccustomed to such defiance from a grieving widow on the verge of destitution, was taken aback. He grumbled something about procedure and trouble before turning to leave, but not before casting one last, long look at the cradle. The message was clear, this was not over. That night, as Lily slept soundly, Eliza carefully examined the only thing that had come with her from the forest besides the tattered blankets. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and hanging from a delicate chain. She had cleaned it carefully. It was surprisingly ornate, far too fine for a pauper's child. With trembling fingers, she managed to pry it open. Inside, there was no picture. There was only a single, exquisitely engraved initial, a capital B. A cold dread washed over her. B for Brody? No. B for Blackwood. The confrontation she knew was coming arrived sooner than she expected. It was not the sheriff this time, but the devil himself. Cyrus Blackwood's black carriage, pulled by two matching stallions that looked as cruel as their master, rolled up her dusty lane like a hearse. Blackwood did not knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of expensive leather and absolute, suffocating power. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with a face carved from granite and eyes as cold and grey as a winter storm. He surveyed her small, clean cottage with a look of profound disgust before his gaze landed on Lily, asleep in Eliza's arms. So, it is true, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with menace. You found it. Eliza clutched Lily tighter, the baby stirring at the sound of his voice. Her name is Lily, she corrected him, her heart hammering against her ribs. And she is a person, not an it. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed Blackwood's face. He was not a man who was accustomed to being corrected. Names are irrelevant. That child is a complication. An unfortunate piece of refuse that should have been disposed of properly. The sheer cruelty of his words stole Eliza's breath. This was a man who saw a helpless infant as trash to be thrown away. Every protective instinct in her body screamed. She is a gift, Eliza countered, her voice shaking but firm. One you clearly cannot comprehend. Blackwood let out a short, dismissive laugh. I comprehend assets and liabilities, Mrs. Thorne. That is all there is in this world. Now, let's talk business. He walked over to her hearth, his polished boot silent on the stone floor. I hold the note on this pathetic plot of land. You are months behind. I am set to repossess it on Friday. However, I am a reasonable man. He turned to face her, his expression a mask of false generosity. Give me the child. No questions asked. And I will burn your mortgage papers right here in this fireplace. You can keep the farm. You can live out your days in peace. A fair trade, would you not agree? It was a devil's bargain. Everything she had, the last link to her husband and her past, in exchange for the life of this innocent child. But the farm was already a ghost to her. Lily was real. Lily was the future. Eliza looked from Blackwood's cold, predatory eyes to the sleeping face of the baby in her arms. The choice wasn't a choice at all. If you enjoy stories of courage against all odds, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these inspiring tales. Eliza raised her chin, the fear inside her crystallizing into steel. There is no trade to be made, Mr. Blackwood. This land is just dirt and wood. It is nothing. This child is everything. Now get out of my house. Blackwood's face darkened, the veneer of civility vanishing completely. His eyes burned with a malevolent fire. You foolish woman, he hissed. You have no idea what you are refusing. You are choosing to stand between me and what is mine. It is a very dangerous place to be. I will have that child. He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard a plate rattled off a shelf and shattered on the floor. The silence he left behind was more terrifying than his presence. Eliza stood trembling, not with fear for herself, but for the tiny life she held. She knew then, with chilling certainty, that Blackwood would not send the sheriff next time. He would come himself, and he would not be coming to talk. The weight of Blackwood's threat settled over the farmhouse like a shroud. Eliza knew she couldn't face him alone. She needed help, but in a town choked by Blackwood's influence, who would dare to stand with her? Her mind raced through the possibilities. The sheriff was bought. The preacher was timid. Most of her neighbors were too deep in debt to Blackwood themselves to risk his wrath. Then she thought of someone on the fringes, someone who might be immune to Blackwood's power, Old Man Hemlock. He was the town's recluse, an herbalist and former doctor who had retreated to a cabin deep in the woods after a falling out with the town council years ago, a council run, of course, by Cyrus Blackwood. Hemlock was said to be eccentric, but he was also known for his sharp mind and unwavering moral compass. Clutching Lily tight, Eliza made the journey to his cabin. She found him tending a garden of strange and fragrant herbs. He listened to her story patiently, his weathered face impassive as he studied the silver locket with the engraved B. Cyrus Blackwood has only ever loved one thing, Hemlock said finally, his voice raspy from disuse. His own ambition. He has a son, a weak-willed boy named Julian. Cyrus has arranged a marriage for him, a union with the daughter of a wealthy industrialist from the East. It's a merger, not a marriage. A scandal, like an illegitimate grandchild, would ruin the entire deal. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The ornate locket. The desperation to be rid of the baby. Lily was Julian Blackwood's daughter. There was a servant girl at the Blackwood estate, Hemlock continued, his eyes soured. A sweet girl named Anna. She was dismissed several months ago. They said she ran off, but no one has seen or heard from her since. The horrifying truth fell upon Eliza like a physical blow. Blackwood hadn't just ordered his own grandchild abandoned in the forest, he had likely done something terrible to the child's mother to cover his tracks. Meanwhile, in the dim light of the town saloon, Deputy Miller was drinking, trying to wash away an image that haunted his sleep, the sight of a tiny, helpless bundle left in the cold, dark woods. He had been the one. Blackwood had given him the order directly. Take care of it, he'd said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Miller, too cowardly to refuse but too human to commit murder, had simply left the baby where he hoped she might be found. He told himself it was the best he could do. But now, hearing the whispers around town of the widow Thorne and the foundling, his cowardice felt like a festering wound. As he nursed his whiskey, he overheard two of Blackwood's hired hands talking in a low murmur. They were laughing about the fire at the Thorne farm a year ago. Old Man Thorne got what was coming to him, one of them slurred. Got too curious about the ledgers. Boss man doesn't like curious folk. Deputy Miller went cold. The fire hadn't been an accident. Eliza's husband had been murdered for getting too close to Blackwood's criminal dealings. The same ruthless evil that had left a baby to die had also made Eliza a widow and a grieving mother. The two events were intertwined, two brutal acts of the same tyrannical hand. In that moment, something inside Deputy Miller snapped. The guilt, the shame, the fear, it was all burned away by a sudden, clarifying rage. He threw a few coins on the bar and strode out into the night, his purpose clear. He wasn't just going to confess. He was going to make it right. He spurred his horse into a gallop, racing towards the Thorne farm, praying he wouldn't be too late. He had to warn her. Blackwood and his men were on their way. The moon was high and cold when the sound of hoofbeats thundered down the lane. But it wasn't Blackwood. It was Deputy Miller, his face pale and his eyes wild with a desperate urgency. He practically fell from his horse, rushing to Eliza's door. "He's coming, Mrs. Thorne," he gasped, breathing heavily. "Blackwood knows you won't give her up. He's coming to take her, and he's not coming alone." He then poured out the whole sordid story, his role in abandoning Lily, the truth about the servant girl Anna, and the chilling revelation about the fire that had killed her family. For Eliza, the news was a tempest. The raw, gaping wound of her grief was suddenly explained, not by fate or accident, but by the calculated evil of one man. Her sorrow was instantly forged into an unbendable, righteous fury. This was no longer just about protecting Lily, it was about avenging her husband and son. It was about tearing down the man who had destroyed her world. "Thank you for telling me, Deputy," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Now, will you help me?" A moment of truth hung in the air. Miller looked at the determined woman before him and the innocent child in the cradle, and he knew his life of cowardice was over. "Yes," he said, his voice steady for the first time in months. "I will." They had little time. Just as they finished barricading the door and windows with heavy furniture, a dark procession arrived. Cyrus Blackwood, flanked by 4 of his most ruthless thugs, stood silhouetted against the moonlight. "Eliza Thorne," he boomed, his voice carrying an ultimatum. "This is your final chance. Open this door and give me the child, or we will burn this house to the ground, just like we did before." The casual, cruel confirmation of his crime hung in the air. Inside, Miller checked his revolver, and Eliza gripped the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white. But just as Blackwood's men approached with torches, another light appeared. Old Man Hemlock emerged from the edge of the woods, holding a lantern high. And he was not alone. Behind him stood a dozen farmers and townspeople, armed with hunting rifles, pitchforks, and a courage they had not known they possessed. They had heard Miller's frantic ride through town, they had heard the rumors, and they had finally had enough of living under Blackwood's thumb. Blackwood stared in disbelief at the assembled crowd. "Fools," he snarled. "You are all in my debt. I own this town." "Not anymore, Cyrus," Hemlock called out, his old voice ringing with authority. "Tonight, we take it back." The standoff was electric. Blackwood, seeing his power evaporating before his eyes, became unhinged. He drew a pistol and aimed it squarely at Eliza's window. "Then you will all watch," he screamed. But before he could fire, Deputy Miller kicked open the door. "It's over, Blackwood," he yelled, leveling his own pistol. "I was there. I know what you did to Anna, and I know what you did to Tom Thorne. I'll testify to all of it." The townspeople gasped, their suspicions confirmed. Blackwood's men, seeing the tables had turned so dramatically, hesitated and then began to back away, unwilling to face a dozen armed farmers for one man's crumbling empire. Enraged and cornered, Blackwood fired wildly, not at Miller, but towards the house, towards the sound of the crying baby. But Eliza was ready. She burst from the doorway, not with a poker but with her husband's old, heavy shotgun, a weapon she hadn't touched since his death. The blast echoed through the night, kicking up dirt right at Blackwood's feet, causing him to stumble and fall. In an instant, the townspeople swarmed forward, disarming him and holding him fast. The tyrant had fallen. The epilogue was written not in days, but in the months of healing that followed. Cyrus Blackwood was tried and convicted, his crimes laid bare by the testimony of Deputy Miller and others who were no longer afraid to speak. His assets were seized, his empire dismantled, and the oppressive weight he had held over the valley for decades was finally lifted. Miller, having faced his demons, was hailed as a hero. He helped establish a new town council, one built on fairness and community, not fear. Old Man Hemlock even agreed to serve on it. And Eliza Thorne, the grieving widow who had walked into the woods to find an end, had instead found a new beginning. The court officially granted her custody of Lily, and the town, as a gesture of its gratitude, collectively paid off the remainder of her mortgage. The farmhouse, once a place of ash and sorrow, became a home again, filled with the light of a wood stove and the bright, happy laughter of a growing child. Eliza would often stand on her porch, holding Lily's small hand, and look out at the fields that were now green and thriving. She had faced the deepest darkness, both in the world and in her own heart, and had emerged into the sun. She had proven that even from the ashes of the most profound loss, new life and unshakable courage could bloom. If you were moved by Eliza's journey, click on the video on your screen now for another story of incredible strength and unexpected hope.